Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar titled The Value of Measuring and Communicating Societal Value and Impact. My name is Baron van Bergen. I'm a partner at EY. And for the last 20 years, I've been helping companies to better understand, measure, quantify, and monetize sustainability ESG impacts and reconciling that with financial data and decision making. Next to my client work, I'm a member of the EY team working with a number of initiatives, including the World Economic Forum International Business Council, in helping to measure and define stakeholder capitalism. Today we have an excellent panel. We have Barney Wild and we have Miguel Pestano. Both panelists actually started their careers in the UK political scene. Miguel as a lobbyist, if I'm not mistaken, and Barney as a parliamentary speechwriter and then as a consultant. Both actually have also worked at Unilever and both also work with senior leadership teams to basically connect societal value and impact with purpose, with long-term strategy and business models. Obviously, there's also some differences. Let me start with Barney. Barney has a long-standing career in corporate affairs and corporate communication. And he's been working with companies like Unilever, Network Rail, Rolls-Royce, and recently National Grid. He actually started his career as a parliamentary speechwriter. So welcome, Barney. And just out of curiosity, how was it to move from the parliament into the corporate world?
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. I was very young, and I realised that people decide to be in politics in the long term, either because they want to do something amazing, or in some cases, unfortunately, because they want to be something. And I did not have that sort of burning ambition at that stage, certainly, to either do or be anything particular. So I walked away.
Wonderful. Thanks again for joining us. And then we have Miguel. Miguel is the Senior Vice President, Corporate Affairs and Sustainability at Reckitt Benckiser. He was previously the Chief Communication Officer of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, known for their science-driven approach and leading edge in impact measurement and valuation. And before that, he spent 13 years at Unilever in various roles, and lastly as the Global Head of External Affairs and Sustainability. And he worked a lot on the Sustainability Living Plan with Paul Polman, the then CEO. So welcome, Miguel, and also a question for you. How is it to be back in the corporate world? I think you're on mute, Miguel.
So thank you very much for inviting me to join you today. And like everyone else, wherever you are, whatever time of the night or day you're watching this, I don't actually feel very different having gone back to the corporate world because I was in it for quite a long time. But a bit like Barney, I actually started out in the political world because I was one of those people that did want to make a difference. Got into politics and realized actually that majority of people who join the political system end up giving up what they care about because they have to do whatever somebody else tells them to do that's tied to a party line. And so actually I realized that I could do more through the business world, have a bigger impact on the world by driving some of the agenda through companies like the one I'm in today than I could ever have had as a politician. So that's why I ended up gravitating to the corporate world.
Wonderful, wonderful. So let me walk you to the agenda for today. And then before handing over to Barney and Miguel, I'll make some opening remarks. So the meat of today is actually hearing from both Barney and Miguel about the journeys that they've been going through with National Grid, with RB, and just sharing some of those experiences in terms of measuring societal value and impact and communicating that. Again, linked to purpose, long-term strategy, and the business model. Then we have the opportunity, and I'll open it up for the floor for questions and answers. So if you have any questions, please let us know, and then we can have a bit of dialogue around that, and then I'll wrap it up. So before handing over to Barney, let me just kick off with a couple of opening remarks. A couple of key trends that we see in impact measurement and valuation. One, obviously, there is a shift from pure shareholder value to stakeholder capitalism. For the 49 years, 50 years after Milton Friedman. And that's, for example, one of the things we see at the WEF IBC, which brings together 120 companies, basically defining, as Brian Moynihan, the chairman and CEO of Bank of America, phrases it, defining stakeholder capitalism with 21 single metrics that companies can use. We'll also talk a little bit, hopefully can reflect a little bit on what COVID has done to this shift, and whether or not this has sort of accelerated the shift to stakeholder capitalism. So we'll hear from Barney and Miguel on that. What we generally see in the market is there's a strong emphasis on value creation. So this is not just a risk mitigation sort of ESG agenda, but a wider value creation story. And companies are trying to identify and develop metrics that help them explain how their long-term strategy provides value to the capital markets and a set of wider stakeholders. And we do see increasing sophistication in the way companies sort of measure impact, not just by input and output indicators, but moving also to outcome and even impact, sometimes in monetized ways. We still see the leading edge with the companies, whilst also, asset managers, investors are getting more sophisticated and better understand how sort of ESG and sustainability outcomes are basically affecting future cash flows and the future prospects of the companies. But in general, we see that a lot of companies sort of moving the way and explaining the capital markets, how their long-term strategy and ESG is affecting future prospects and cash flows. At the same time, we see an alphabet soup, a myriad of initiatives, around sustainability, around impact measurement, and a strong appetite for convergence. The big five standard setters, and soon four, if IRSC and SASB will merge, there's a strong push to get to one standard for all things non-financial. And there are a couple of initiatives out there that you can see here, the IVR, the VBA, and the IMP, that are actually working on standardizing impact measurement and valuation. So over the last couple of years, we've seen an acceleration of companies that are getting better in understanding and measuring, quantifying, and sometimes even monetizing impacts, and reconciling that with their financial statement, but also to help that in decision-making and informing strategy. So with that, without further ado, let me hand it over to you, Barney. And yeah, please, if you could reflect a little bit on your perspectives on impact measurement and valuation, and what you have been doing throughout your career and recently with National Grid. So over to you, Barney.
Thanks, Barrett. Delighted to be here, as I said, and delighted to be on a panel with Miguel. And I remember some pretty heady days at Unilever. Miguel and I, we were fellow global VPs at the time. This is about 8-9 years ago. We're both engaged in working out how to engage our people and the external world with this new sustainable living plan ambition and set of commitments in a way that was both engaging but also credible. And it really felt like we were breaking new ground then. Today we're looking, or I'm going to look certainly at not just at the how and the what of measurement and ESG and so on, but also the why. I think you do need to start with the why in order to really get a good handle on the how and the what. Why do companies do this? And therefore, what are the implications for measurement? So companies, of course, are increasingly being asked what good they are doing, what their genuine purpose is beyond making money for their employees and shareholders. In ESG, of course, is helpful as a means of reporting on elements of that. But as you're going to see, hopefully in what I'm going to say in the next few minutes, it's only one and in some ways quite a narrow tool for doing that. So let me talk to you a bit about National Grid. When I arrived there in 2018, there were lots of good things happening at National Grid, and it was probably second quartile in the ESG ratings. But their efforts were quite disparate and quite disconnected. And my very clear sense was there was a disconnect between what National Grid thought of itself and what others thought. And also between where the company was focusing its good intentions versus where others wanted it to go. And the company needed a methodology and a framework that would enable it to drive its commitments to responsible business into its strategy in a more focused and coherent way. So we developed a project team. It was a deliberate blend of strategy folk, of finance people, of corporate affairs folk. EY were brought in, did a huge amount of work for us. This lasted the best part of a year. And we also engaged an external reputation company called Stonehaven to do the outside-in piece as well. And I was the overall sponsor for this and the executive sponsor. Interestingly, by the way, there was a very heavy strategy team focus for the first 6 to 8 months, but the strategy folk melted away really, and it was then taken forward, and it's still now being driven forward by a mixture of the finance team and the corporate affairs team working very closely together. There was massive engagement both with external stakeholders and internally, and I know EY, they racked up over 750 hours of contact with National Grid senior managers and leaders across the company. And using the total societal impact approach, some of you might be familiar with, and the external engagement, we gained 2 things. The first thing we gained was a really clear, objective and scientific assessment of National Grid societal and environmental impact, and crucially of its potential impact in the future. Second, if you like, a more subjective assessment of what our important customers and other stakeholders wanted from us. And as you're going to see from what I say, I think both of these elements are crucial. It's kind of the yin and yang, if you like, of decent societal impact and societal value assessment. So we began the process of reviewing performance in each area and began to map where we wanted it to go and how we could get there. This exercise led to the development of a responsible business framework, that's what we called it, based on 5 pillars. And I want to dwell for a second on this, because 2 of the pillars were environment and governance, as you would expect, the E and the G from ESG. The S, we split into 2. And I think if you look at how the S of ESG has exploded, particularly in the last year, and in some ways it's just too big a thing, society. You can see why we had to do that. We split into 2. One, people, as in our people, and secondly, our communities. And then the other pillar, the 5th pillar we added was the economy. Remember, this was a total societal impact approach. And again, for me, one of the challenges with ESG is it doesn't take enough account of a company's external economic benefit. So we worked on developing specific commitments and ambitions with timeframes and measures to assess progress. Commitments represent what the company knows how to achieve and it will achieve, and in most cases under a very specific time frame. They're not necessarily easy to uphold, but they're clear and they have straightforward metrics for success. Either you meet this publicly stated goal or you don't. After much wrangling to and from, we also came up with a relatively small number of what we called ambitions or goals that the company isn't entirely sure how it's going to achieve them, and it's quite open about that, but it thinks it's really important to try. And it believes it's really important to be striving for those ambitions over the long term. And crucially, for both the commitments and the ambitions, we committed to being open and transparent both about our plans and about our progress, and to report regularly and transparently on the progress towards those. We committed to producing an annual responsible business report alongside our annual report, and we hardwired our commitments and ambitions into the company's governance and planning processes in various ways, especially via, for those of you who are in-house who are familiar with the QBR methodology, the quarterly business reviews. These are essentially where the key members of the executive, the chief executive and the CFO normally, and often others, they go round each business unit of the company on a quarterly basis and spend quite a lot of time, usually a couple of days, deep dive every quarter with that unit, looking at all of their metrics, looking at how they're doing commercially, how they're doing operationally, how they're doing financially. And what we did is we added in all these non-financial metrics and commitments and ambitions into that process. So there's nowhere to hide internally. It's early days. We only launched the Responsible Business Report in this last October, but three things are already clear. Firstly, there's much clearer strategic alignment in the company, and certainly at the senior level. If you look at the decisions being taken, and if you look at the tone and the clarity of the conversations, it's, I think, quite a long way from where things were 2.5 years ago, because we are very clear, if you like, what our North Star is. We're very clear what our purpose is. Secondly, it was hugely motivational for our people. It's really helped create and sustain internal emotional alignment, but also, if you like, intellectual alignment around the company priorities and the direction of travel for the organization. And thirdly, just on the ESG side, we are very confident that we'll go from sort of second quartile, middle of the pack, to very heavily into the top quartile for ESG and all the benefits that flow in terms of our ESG ratings and investor ratings. In conclusion, just a few thoughts. I think the most important thing is you need to know why you are doing this. As a company, why are you undertaking this exercise and what are your ambitions from it? And the starting point should not just be to improve your ESG ratings. If that's your starting point, you're not going to do it very well. It is, and for me, it's almost one of the kind of the fortunate side effects of what you do, but it's not the main point. To get there, I think you need to be able to answer two questions in terms of answering the question of why you're doing this. And one is objective and the other one is more subjective. The first question you need to be able to answer is, how is the world a better place by your company being successful? In other words, what is your societal value? And I find the phrase of societal value very helpful when we think about this space. The second question companies need to answer is, what do we need to do to ensure sustainable, high quality relationships with our customers, with our employees, with our investors, and with the other stakeholders who are important to us, by showing that the company is committed to a genuine long-term relationship with them and with the environment, based on doing the right thing for all stakeholders. Now, clearly, investors and employees are arguably and often the two most important stakeholders for this, and in many cases, they will be the two most important stakeholders. But I would say they're not the only ones. So, for example, two data points. One, there's lots of data now on consumer behavior and how that's changed particularly in the last 5 to 8 years, but in particular the last 9 months, where more and more people, particularly millennials, are now making very active, very deliberate choices in their shopping patterns and then their spending patterns. And secondly, actually, I would call out citizens as opposed to consumers and shoppers as well. And in a recent survey found that 92% of American citizens actively want large corporations to promote an economy that serves all Americans. And that metric is a much greater number than it would have been, than it was a year or more ago. So in summary, you need to think beyond ESG. You need to realize ESG is an essentially, and I'll be interested in comments on this, but for me, ESG is an IR, an investor relations attempt to provide assurance to the market that the company will not do anything harmful or otherwise unacceptable. That is fundamentally what ESG comes. So its heritage, it comes from attempts to provide a proxy for damage prevention and limitation. It is about risk mitigation, ESG, at its heart. And of course, this is essential. This is absolutely essential, of course, but it's not enough. And I do think that there's a risk that as we increasingly and correctly systematize ESG, that we turn it into a bit of a slightly unthinking mechanical process, and the risk is it misses the real value that it should be there for. I think in addition to the set requirements, the external requirements for ESG reporting, companies do need to, starting from their purpose, therefore choose a small and distinctive set of societal value themes, the areas that are directly relevant and the core to them as a company and the industry in which they operate in which they can have a meaningful positive impact across both total societal value and total shareholder return. And such an exercise, often combined with rigorous scenario planning, can enable companies to really clarify their overall purpose and provide a small set of very clear, ambitious targets to aim for. And they should then be in a position to tell internally and externally a really clear, cohesive story of how societal value and purpose is part of their core business strategy and of the financial and societal benefits they expect to achieve. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Barney, and we'll open up for questions a bit later. Miguel, can I ask you, over to you for your presentation.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'm still showing as Barney Wild, by the way, but that's okay. Because there I am. It's not unexpected, perhaps, to hear much of what Barney said. I'm going to repeat. I may say it in a slightly different way, but I think what's interesting is that there are a lot of parallels and a lot of alignment and consistency with what you've just heard Barney relay to you. I joined RB 3 years ago, and I came in, and in fact, I sit on the executive, so I'm, which is also an interesting statement in of itself, because I think 5 years ago, it probably wouldn't have been the case that you would have had the chief sustainability officer sitting on the exec of a company, of a FTSE listed business, but I'm there today. And I think that speaks to the intent, and I think it's a recognition of the critical importance that this is going to play in the strategic direction of the future of the company. I think also to say it, this is not about how you demonstrate compliance. It's not. It is partly about, definitely about how you demonstrate you manage your risk. Increasingly, this is about how it drives your long-term sustainable growth ambitions as a company, and therefore it's intrinsically linked to your corporate strategy. But your corporate strategy has to be built off your corporate purpose. It's the big question of the why do you exist. Now, when I joined, I've had one thing has happened, which is we've brought in a new CEO who clearly sees that this is a critical path for RB to take in the future, sees this as an integral part of our future strategic ambitions. Everything I'm going to talk to you about is still work in progress for us, so you may not yet be familiar with some of the things I'm about to describe, because we're literally going through it now. But let me start by saying that the first thing that we did was answer that question, the purpose question. So if you actually look at what we say our corporate purpose is, we talk a lot about our purpose being about protecting, healing, and nurturing in the relentless pursuit of a cleaner, healthier world. And you may say, well, what's that got to do with the business? Well, actually, protect, heal, and nurture represents the three categories of our business, because we're a nutrition business, we're a hygiene company, and we're a consumer health business. And therefore, protect, heal, and nurture is just a human expression of our business structure. The relentless pursuit piece speaks to entrepreneurship. It speaks to how entrepreneurial we are as a company and what it is that we're in service of, which ultimately is the cleaner, healthier world. Well, cleaner, hygiene is the foundations for health. Healthy, because we're a consumer health company. But if you apply that same logic, protect, heal, and nurture and cleaner, healthier also applies to planet and people. It's the way that we provide that benefit to the communities that we serve and to the planet and the planetary boundaries that we're trying to work within. So I think it's important that you understand you start there. We also have something called a corporate fight, which makes us quite different from other companies. Something we worked on last year, and we talk about that through the lens of access. And what is that doing? Well, it drives your portfolio choice. It drives the way that you look at your future investments. It determines how you partner and who you partner with. And it also is a determinant of, for example, how you engage with even things like corporate philanthropy. So I think this is actually quite pivotal to kind of the starting point for then how it drives your corporate strategic ambitions and how you talk about your corporate strategy. The second thing that hasn't been touched on, we've forgotten to mention that this is increasingly part of the governance oversight of boards. Boards have an obligation under the Companies Act, Section 172, if you're a listed FTSE company, puts the emphasis increasingly on board oversight, and companies having to now talk about their corporate purpose and have boards that talk about their engagement with stakeholders and how that stakeholder engagement is driving board decision making and their engagement with the executive. And what you're seeing, therefore, is that board oversight is encouraging companies and their executives to also have to factor into the equation how they are thinking about that in relation to their day-to-day business operations. So it's not just about the driver coming from, if you like, within the company. It's also coming from the board, and that's also tied to regulatory and other obligations that companies have to fulfill. So there's an element of that that we should not lose sight of. And then I think Barney is absolutely right. There are changing external expectations. You don't necessarily change your purpose or your fight, but what you do understand is that the nature of how that gets expressed and the expectations that you have to deliver against that are changing all the time. And COVID has been an accelerator of some of that. And actually what you have to do is be prepared to flex and adapt. So come back to measurement. So what is measurement there for? Measurement isn't just there because you need to report against something and you have to declare that, and that's part and parcel of the compliance route. Measurement's there to drive how you operationalize this into the organization and how that operational change is going to drive growth. So everything has to be linked to how you look at non-performance indicators within your business model. Now we're going through that process now, and next year, first half of next year, part of my responsibility will be to talk about our 10-year 2030 ambitions as a business. And some of that will be public facing. So there will be a set of metrics and key KPIs that we talk about. And by the way, everything that Barney said about the difference between a commitment and an ambition, I fully subscribe to, because there are going to be those things that you want to have very clear targets on. They're going to be time bound. They're going to be specific in percentage terms. And those are things that you really see yourself operationally delivering. And then there are going to be things which we also talk about in terms of ambition. And these are things that we don't quite yet know how to do, but acknowledge as a company that this is something that we have to make progress on. And so this differentiation between the operational, specific, nitty-gritty and those things that are more aspirational and inspirational, I think is something that we have to get the balance right on. And it's going to be very specific to your core business strategy, which in turn, as I said, has also got to demonstrate how it's delivering against the corporate purpose and the, in our case, our corporate fight. So everything is intrinsically linked. And by the way, we've also talked about the importance of this from how it drives culture and the kind of people that you want to attract to the business, the kind of people you want to retain in the business. So some of this is also tied to the cultural metrics of the organization, because it's for me, one of the most critical metrics in this space is the willingness to recommend the company as a place to work, because encapsulated in that one metric is people's feelings about how they treated themselves, how they feel others in the company, what they feel more about the company's activities more broadly. And if you're willing to recommend it, that means that you truly think of it as a place that you value, and that you're willing to have somebody come who's a friend or a family member come and work for you. That is a true proof point that things that you're doing as a company are really delivering that value proposition. So what we see is there are a set of key, what we see as strategic indicators, outcome-driven indicators. A few of those that we look at the leadership level. One of those metrics is a good example of one I've just cited. You then have operating metrics and numbers, which you, in our case, what we are building is the operating governance mechanism for who's accountable and responsible for what right across the organization against each one of those. And the important piece of that is that some of those can be inward facing. So you may be having internal targets that may be more stretching, more pushing of you from an operating framework perspective. But obviously, clearly, therefore, you're not necessarily always sure about how far you're going to make progress on that. And those that are outward facing, things that you are absolutely subscribing to and committing to do in a public way. And I think having some of those variances does allow you to perhaps sometimes push yourself harder internally and not feel that you're going to overcommit and not be able to deliver against them in the external world and not meet the societal expectations that are out there. And lastly, I think we see this. I think there's an important conversation around tonality, which is what's the narrative that you build around this. I think we have to always be careful between defining and setting targets and ambitions which are inspirational and aspirational, with what is feasible and realistic. What it is possible for you to actually do within a defined time frame based on what level of investment you can actually afford. And then you need to understand how does what you're prepared to do. I mean, often the aspirational and the inspirational is what's driven by the outside, what expectations you might see others having of you. Often the more, shall we say, realistic and feasible is often the conversation you have inside, which is, but can we really do that? And do we have the resources to deliver against that? And if we want to make this shift, how, you know, what is it, what level of investment does that require, and then where does that investment come from? Because inevitably there are always these conversations that you have, as I do, at an executive level about where you allocate your resources and what choices you're making. But as sort of the last point I would make, I mean, I think when you see this through the lens of how it integrates across the organization, you need to understand that it is the driver of your innovation investments. You know, if you want to decarbonize your value chain, and brands, by the way, I think are increasingly going to see that as something that they have to have a conversation with their consumers about. You know, scope 3 is part of the next conversation that we have, and that takes you right at the heart of how you engage consumers in that discourse and how you drive behavioral change, because so much of the life cycle impacts of many brands is based on how the consumers use, and then how do you create a more circular process rather than a linear one. And that does shift the way that you engage and dialogue and market to those individuals. But also you have to start to create the measurement, the tools that are going to allow you to have an honest and transparent conversation with those consumers about the carbon impacts of your brands and services. Well, that's got to drive your innovation pipeline. It's got to drive your procurement pipeline. It's got to drive your marketing pipeline. And you need to think about how you invest across all of those areas, because you can't just invest in one pillar. It's got to be multi-dimensional, and it's got to drive across your organization. And how you, in a sense, break the silos and create the governance tools and the governance mechanisms that allow you to think in a much more joined up way internally. I think that's one of the reasons why governance becomes so critical. And that's why there's so much attention being paid increasingly to the governance mechanisms that are being established to implement some of the commitments that people are speaking to. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to take any questions. And as I said, I fully subscribe to everything that Barney said at the outset. But then again, I guess having two old Unilever people here on the panel, you might expect that.
Thank you, Miguel. That was fascinating. Thank you, Barney and Miguel, for sharing that journey and your insights into quite distinct and different sectors. But as you pointed out, quite some similarities as well. We got quite a few questions coming in, so let me mention a few. I mean, first sort of category of questions are around the role of finance. A4S has done an amazing amount of work in involving finance leaders. They have the CFO network. So a number of questions on, do you see a link, correlation, or even causation between societal value, or TSI, Barney, as you phrased it, and the success of business, TSR or financial performance? And is that important when you go into the journey? That's one question around finance. The other one, and then maybe you can both reflect on these things. The other one is, what is the role of the CFO, and what is the role of the finance function in all of this? So maybe Barney, starting with you, can you talk a little bit about both those dimensions?
Yeah, sure. So with the first question, that so the link between, if you like, total shareholder return and total societal impact, and why do all this stuff? I mean, it's the $1 million question. There is certainly increasing evidence that there is a link, and the reasons for that differ often by company and by sector. So, two data points. One, at Unilever, they are absolutely clear that the brands that they offer, the sustainable brands with a sustainable societal value offering, do significantly better commercially than their other brands. That's interesting. And also, people like BCG and McKinsey have done some very interesting work. And so actually, BCG's Total Societal Impact Report, they have found a very clear positive relationship between ESG performance and EBITDA and margins, in particular in the consumer packaged goods industries, in biopharmaceuticals, in oil and gas, and in retail and banking. And all of those, they found gross margins between sort of 3 and 9 points higher for companies that were very good at ESG and strong in the ESG rankings compared to others. So those are my two answers to that. I'd be fascinated to hear what Miguel thinks, and of course, Barend is quite an expert on that. On the role of the CFO, I think, finance is critical to this, because ultimately, to do this properly, as Miguel said so brilliantly, this is about embedding purpose at the heart of everything in your company, including your business strategy, including your capital allocation, including your M&A, and all the rest of it. All of that has to absolutely be owned by finance. My experience is that what it doesn't mean is that finance can get you there. It needs to be a genuine partnership internally between finance, corporate affairs, often HR, often group strategy if there's a strong strategy division, and of course the operating units to get you there. But as I said in my presentation, I think as you operationalize it, it needs to be operationalized and driven by the finance function internally through the various systems and assurances and ways of doing business that the company has, and held to account by the CFO. Hope that helps.
Great. Miguel, any reflections there on those 2 points? Questions?
Yeah, so I'm not going to repeat what Barney just said, because I agree with everything that he said, but I also tried to say to mine, of course the finance function is critical, because the CFO has oversight and has the systems and processes and tools that can help support how we track against it. But ownership and oversight are two different things. So you need to look across the organization as a whole. That's why I talked about the leadership team. The CEO is as critical an owner of this as the CFO, to be honest. The CEO can do an awful lot to determine the pace. They can drive a lot of the levels of ambition. They give permission in many ways to what it is that the rest of the organization feels empowered to do. So, this is not just a CFO-led process. It's right across the organization. As I said, I sit on the executive, so I actually have I'm just as much part of day-to-day business conversations as any of my peers on the leadership. And everyone on that leadership team, in some ways, is going to have to be accountable or own part of the delivery of what of the ambitions that we're setting out and embarking on. So the benefit of the CFO is that they have the finance structures are there to help support the way in which you seek to track and monitor and monetize, because behind that we have sort of means of looking at where do we make the capital allocations. Those always get discussed at obviously at the exec level, but finance is the team that we look to help to build the model for that. And I think Barney also talked about chief strategy officer. There's a lot of this is about how you build long-term strategic planning, and that's also part of the role that a chief strategy officer plays. So setting the levels of ambition. Where do you want the business to go in the next 5 to 10 years? Where are some of the blockers to that, or potentially also where are the opportunities for that? So, I just want to stress that I just want to not underplay the importance of the CFO, but on the other hand, I also don't think we should put all of the emphasis on the CFO. I think you have to understand that this is really about accountability that sits right across the leadership team of an organization. And also on the the deliverables. I think, look, I think I said at the outset, I think, and Barney said the same thing. I think, you know, if you look at this, this is really about what does this do for your people, the talent attraction, how does it drive people to come into your organization state? How does it make them feel? And I mean, I genuinely see a strong correlation between productivity and this, because it's the thing that motivates people. It drives and fuels the innovation pipeline. It's the thing that makes more of the right caliber of people want to come to your organization. So if you start there, I think you're building value creation for the organization in the long run through people, because people capital is as important as financial capital in many ways. Because that drives performance. On the financial performance, all the data is clearly there. You can see the companies that have done more in this space are tending to be more resilient, are tending to deliver longer term shareholder value. But it's this tension point all the time between the short term and the medium to long term return. There's always seems to be a debate between these two things. But the reality of most companies is you have to do both. You have to manage for the short as well as the medium to long. The question always is in the room is, what's the balance? Where are the trade-offs, or where are the things you have to talk about? But the obligation on a company is always to manage it for the longer term interest of the shareholder and the investor. I think also keep in mind, I see a significant uptick in the number of investors that are now thinking about their investment in you based on your ESG performance. And I think it's going to be a bigger driver of shareholder decisions and choices and accountability. So, it won't be long before, at least, a quarter of all the shares traded on the FTSE are probably going to be heavily influenced by key ESG determinants. So it is a driver of value creation. If you get it right, it can be a source of value creation for the business.
Great. Thanks, Miguel. And on employees, Barney, I remember one of the outputs of Project Impact at National Grid at the time was the job that can't wait, and I think it was even awarded at the time. Could you say a little bit about how societal value is important in the energy sector, where you are working on a clean, affordable, and fair energy future of energy? How important is that employee proposition, and what did the project do for that employee proposition in hindsight?
Yeah, I mean, the employee piece is crucial, and as I reference, there's a Harvard Business Review report a few years ago, about 2 or 3 years ago now, and it was a survey of senior company executives, and it asked them, what does your company have a clear purpose? Which most said no. Do you think it's important? Yes. Why? What are the reasons why you think it's important to have a clearer purpose for your company? And they gave 5 main answers. The first reason, the most important reason, was employee satisfaction and motivation. This is senior company executives throughout the US and Western Europe. Number 2 was external advocacy. And by the way, for what it's worth, the next 3 were likely success and transformation efforts, higher quality products and services, and greater customer loyalty. I think it's absolutely crucial. I mean, I remember at Unilever, it was a bit of a back of an envelope calculation with HR, just about how much money are we saving from the wage bill. Now, this sounds a bit mercenary, but it's the reality is that, and this is material, companies that are purpose driven, that are good places to work, where there's a real kind of purpose behind them, people want to work there and are prepared to accept less money to work there. And at Unilever, we worked out that was, I can't remember the exact, there wasn't an exact figure, but it was in the many hundreds of millions savings a year simply off the wage bill by not having to pay so much of a premium, compared to, in some cases, some of our competitors in consumer goods, but also certainly against competitors in the consultancy markets, in banking and financial services and retail financial services and so on. So it's absolutely critical. And to Barron's question, yeah, I mean, it did win awards. We did a big campaign called The Job That Can't Wait, which was ostensibly a recruitment campaign, but it was really about allowing us to tell the story. But it was about motivating existing employees and potential future employees about saying, do you want to come and join something that's amazing and that's brilliant, that is driving towards a net zero world? And we had a 5-fold increase in the number of applicants for our graduate trainee scheme and our apprentice scheme that year. It was absolutely extraordinary, and I mean, we had to close the campaign at the end because it was getting embarrassing. So it is hugely motivational. People always talk about millennials, and the people currently in their 20s and early 30s, and there are some signs that, particularly in terms of consumer preference, they are massively motivated. But actually, I think it works at all ages. Everyone wants to work, at all ages, want to work for a company that does the right thing, that has a wider purpose, that is doing good in the world. And if you can get there, you will get much better people and much more discretionary effort, as Miguel said, and they'll want to work for you longer and harder.
May I come in on this? Because I think, look, I think I mean, I didn't even talk in my interview, I didn't really talk about the change in customer focus, or the change in consumer focus, or the ability to partner. If you want to innovate, partnership often now increasingly is about smart collaboration, finding different ways of doing it. RB itself, we're going on a pretty significant transformational journey. So part of the story that we've told so far as a company is the story of how we want to reconfigure our business and how we're going to drive our business growth ambitions. And that's what we started with last year. So we're going through that transformational journey right now. And we've just been, and as we went through talking about that, we were going to talk more about some of the things that I'm been touching on, the sort of non-financials, but the things that are part of your footprint, part of the way that you play your role in the world and you contribute. But obviously COVID happened in the middle of that. And actually the challenge that we've had most in that period has been one of business continuity, because so many thousands of our people have continued to produce and work in our factories, and in many cases have had to work even harder because there was so much demand, pent-up demand for things like Dettol or Lysol, but just as much for things like Nurofen or whatever. The people wanted to work hard, because they also saw that it was in service of us living our purpose. It actually underscored the fact that people felt a connection to what it is that we stand for and stand behind. And that actually was a big motivator and a big source of why it is that people made the effort, because they thought and see themselves as employees, not just helping the company to grow, but in service of the society, of society, in service of our customer and our consumer at the end of the day. And part of also our obligation to keep people safe and keep people healthy, that's also kind of shifted the dynamic of the conversation we have internally. And it's created a very different sense. Virtual conversations like this have humanized the dialogue in many ways. So there's a lot of things that are shifting and changing as we think about what this all signifies. But the COVID pandemic, in many ways for me, has just reinforced all the reasons why some of the things that we're talking about actually matter, because they're the things that hold the company together when you go through some of those tough times, as much as the things that can help drive the growth when you're trying to take the company on a transformational journey. And my last observation would be, for us, I mean, I would stress that I don't think RB is actually a leader in the pack. I would not say that. But I think it's important you understand that if a company like ours that is sort of trying to ensure that it does the right thing, that it sees itself playing a different role in the world, that's actually really an important signal, because when you think about the companies that often you talk about when we talk about these types of events, it is the sort of the Unilevers of this world that often get sort of pulled into these types of panels. But I think what's really important is to understand that if companies like ours, like mine, is going through that journey, that says something, because what it says is it's becoming a driver of what mainstream business is doing. And that's a really good thing, because it's a proof point that the world is changing. So I don't think necessarily RB would see itself as a thought leader in this space, but I think we're trying to be thoughtful and honest and transparent about what we are doing and how that sits within our business transformational journey, we're not trying to be, if you like, trying to take credit for this or trying to say that we're doing something more perhaps than others. This isn't about that for us. It's really at the heart of who we are and what we're trying to stand for in the future. And I think that's important for people to take on board, because behind me are more companies like us who are going on the same journey.
Thanks, Miguel. I mean, we have a lot of questions coming in, but conscious of time, let me just do one more question before I'll ask you to maybe give you a bit of a final reflection, and then I'll try to wrap up here. There's a lot of questions coming in on how do you prioritize? How do you prioritize your focus areas, your indicators? How can you choose between right and right? What will be your advice, Barney? If I can start with you.
Yeah, sure. So I talk quite a lot about that. I think it is there are different ways of doing that, but essentially you need to, it's about materiality assessments. So it's about really having a degree of science about working out what are the areas where you as an organization has an impact on society and on the world, and where you have choices about where you might want to minimize your negative impacts in the future or accentuate the positives, or indeed both. But alongside that, if that's the objective side, alongside that, the subjective side, which is to use some expert help. You might have it in-house, you might have to buy it in, to help you really understand external expectations now and in the future about what people expect from you as an industry and you specifically as a company. And to some degree, you need to go with popular sentiment on that. And it might actually be mass. Where is the population going? Because it's surprising how often companies by definition are quite introspective. Companies by definition have a lot of people who've been working there often a very long time. At National Grid, the median tenure was 19 years. So the average length of time an employee had been at National Grid was 19 years. Now, that may be or may not be typical for the companies that you're in, but it does mean that the risk is that people lose a bit of perspective, and certainly that external perspective about what do people think of them or what do people expect of them. And you might well need to hire some specialist help to get you through that. And what that does is it doesn't lead you to the obvious single right answer, but it frames the right choices for saying, okay, these are the options, these are where we have the most impact, and these are where people think and want us to have the most impact or reduce our impacts, and focus from there. And yes, and it does mean having to prioritize, and that means having to very rigorously prioritize. And in getting to your purpose and getting to a clear strategy, if you are not very clear what you are deprioritizing and what you're not going to focus on and what you're not going to do, then you haven't got a strategy. Then you haven't done it properly.
Right.
But it is about doing a few things really, really well.
Right. Miguel, any build on that?
I agree.
Any reflections?
I agree with Barney completely. I think though that this is the mix between thinking about external expectations, not just today, but where there will be in 5 to 10 years. Expectations, by the way, not just in terms of consumer, but other stakeholders. So the expectations are through the lens of the stakeholders, not necessarily a single audience, which is important. It's not just the investor. It's because investor decisions are often influenced by what other stakeholders are asking of investors to take account of. And this forward-looking element means that you can both build your resilience as well as your opportunity. I think it is about being choiceful based on the footprint of your business, i.e. where you think you have the biggest impact. I'll give you an example. We are a company that has a big, strong presence in sexual health and well-being. We sell brands like Durex and KY and everything, and other brands that are actually one of the biggest companies in that sector. So it's only natural that you would see us leaning in heavily on issues like HIV or sexually transmitted disease. I mean, there are still 1 million people a day that contract a sexually transmitted disease. That's 350 million people a year. So there's a lot that you can do to be a thought leader or have a significant share of voice and be a disruptive voice in that category, because that's a place that you can have a leadership role and exercise a leadership role. It may be different in other cases. And so you have to define that based on your footprint and your portfolio and your business strategic ambition. So all of these things link. And then as Barney says, you then start to make choices. And by the way, those choices are also defined by affordability and the ability that you have as a company, because you've got a number of other things that you also need to invest behind as well.
Wonderful. Again, conscious of time, what would be sort of your final thoughts, maybe a challenge or a recommendation to the audience, when thinking about measuring and communicating societal value and impact? Bonnie, maybe you can start with you and then over to Miguel for sort of a final reflection, and then I'll try to draw the panel to a close.
I suppose I think hopefully we haven't been too kind of one track in our conversation, but as Miguel and I have been saying, it's the risk is that ESG becomes a measurement process. And all of this becomes quite systematized, and don't let that happen. To some degree it has to happen, but of course you need to always be taking a step back, going say, where's the value here? Not only what is the value for the world in terms of SDGs and so on, but what is the value for the company? Because that is how companies themselves are thinking. What is the value for us? Not in a selfish way, but in an enlightened way. And you have to go through and also within companies, like any organizations, with this sort of thing, lots of people will have lots of very bright ideas, and lots of people will have wonderful ideas for, we could go and do this, or we could go and do this CSR thing over here, or let's get into this over here, and so on. And this process about defining your purpose, and from there being very clear on your strategy and your strategic priorities, it gives you a compass and a North Star for deciding what are we going to do and what are we not going to do in a way that works for people, in a way that rationalizes it. Otherwise, the risk is you have lots of people going off with their own little hobbyist ideas and pursuing their own things, all of which are kind of good to some degree, but which add up to not very much. It is a process for allowing strategic focus and therefore operational focus at a time, but let's face it, when businesses really need that.
Thank you. Miguel, anything, final reflection from your side? I think you're back on mute.
I was going to say, sorry, I agree with Barney's comment on that completely. I think this idea that you look at the places where you can scale and where you can have the biggest impact is always the place to invest the biggest resource behind, because that will drive bigger impacts. And then, understanding that that's part of your narrative, because you always have to be choiceful, but you also have to be clear why those choices are there, because otherwise sometimes there may be heightened expectations from the world outside that you're going to work on everything. Well, obviously that isn't always possible to do. I also think on this measurement conversation, I think, getting alignment and some degree of consistency, you talked about it in your opening comments. I think, of course, that's actually a very valuable thing to do. And we've been better at doing that, I think, around the environmental pillar and we've got some greater consistency and harmonized approaches to it. I think on the social, which funnily enough is where the majority of people's attention has been probably over the last year and will continue to be in the next 2 to 3, and at least for the foreseeable, that's an area where we need to put more effort behind getting alignment, consistency, and some degree of coherence, because obviously you always want to have some degree of comparability or benchmarking in this exercise. But it's then the recognition that we're not just doing this for reporting or benchmarking. It's the fact that you will have your own operating framework, which is always going to be shaped more by your strategic intent and driven by your purpose. So I think both are important, both play a slightly different role. And that would be my my closing observation or comment.
Wonderful, wonderful. So I'm going to be very brief in summing up. I know we've covered much more, but I think it's fair to say that the debate around how to measure and communicate impact is really going mainstream with the different stakeholders, not just the investors. And I think companies, quite clearly, I think the discussion has shown that they need to be able to show, how their long-term strategy linked to their purpose and their business model is providing value to investors and other stakeholders. Again, I think investors and companies are becoming more sophisticated, in this area, and we're moving from input, output to outcome-based measures, and even sometimes impact in a monetized way. I think several buy-in for initiatives are helping to cut to the alphabet soup and really helping to converge, societal value and financial value, and the way we measure and capture that value. And lastly, and we haven't been able to cover that, we also see the standard setters on the back of those buy-in for initiatives, like the Embankment Project for Inclusive Capitalism, like the World Economic Forum IBC project, are getting more active in many parts of the world, including in the US with the SEC on human capital disclosures, are getting more active. And over time, we'll see one standard for all things non-financial, extra-financial, pre-financial. So with that, let me wrap up and thank again Barney and Miguel. Thank you very much for being with us and sharing your experience and insight here. And thanks everyone for listening. Hope you found it useful. Thank you very much.